How's it going, everyone? This is the Maniac Gamer, welcoming you into the House of Horror. Tonight, I'm going to explain my memories and go nostalgia with the first two games that I started out with on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And those two games are Ghosts and Goblins and Castlevania. Yeah, I got custom game cases for both of these games. The front and back of the cover art is actually scans of the original NES game boxes. I need to get around to making a video about these custom game cases eventually. Yeah, these custom game cases are pretty cool. Plus there will be extras to talk about at the end. The last House of Horror episode I did was my first video in the House of Horror series. And the game was considered to be the first survival horror game ever made. And that one was Haunted House on the Atari 2600. But now in this episode, I'm personally going to be explaining about my beginning of how horror in video games started for me. Let's talk about the first horror game that I started out with on my sister's NES. Yeah, back then my sister had the NES console. And this one out of all is personally my first ever cartridge that my parents bought for me as a kid. Ghosts and Goblins. I don't know how my mom ever heard about this one. She kinda thinks that the game looks like a cute adventure game or something. And I wouldn't know how she would figure it out, because she's definitely not a gamer. But she knew I wanted something different besides Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, which I played that game repeatedly over and over again. And I'm really thankful that she got this game for me. I had a lot of experience with that one. It kind of gets me the idea what other games that are out there, what my idea is for the next game. When I played Ghosts and Goblins, I was pretty excited that I was playing a different game cartridge for the first time. And the game was quite enjoyable. But it can also be extremely difficult, and it takes a lot of practice and patience to beat the game, which I had time for back then. And come to think of it, nowadays looking at the game, I find it quite bizarre and a cute sense of humor. Back then I played through the game quite a bit until I got tired of it. And I didn't realize that after the first playthrough, at the end of the castle, after you defeat the last boss, it turned out that it was a trap devised by Satan. A trap devised by Satan. To get the true ending, you have to go through the entire game again, except on a harder difficulty. Yeah, you have to go through the game twice to get a happy ending. Actually, you have to go through the game 3 times for the happy ending. Going through it for the second time just gives you a good ending. I suppose a good ending is better than the bad ending, right? And going through the game 3 times is a complete waste of time. I wish they at least have a difficulty setting to choose from. And when you beat the game 3 times and get the true ending, they didn't even proofread the ending. There were a lot of things that I didn't understand about Ghosts and Goblins, except it was playable and enjoyable. It was years later that I learned that there were sequels on the 16-bit consoles that I didn't look into back then. Which back then, in the 16-bit days, I lost interest in Ghosts and Goblins. So I didn't pay much attention on the 16-bit counterpart about the Ghosts and Goblins games. I also learned that Ghosts and Goblins and the sequels like Ghouls and Ghosts was originally arcade games. I found out about it on the Capcom's Classic Collection compilation on the Xbox and the PS2. Yes, when the compilation came out, I played the arcade emulation port and I was stunned. I also played the sequel Ghouls and Ghosts a little bit for the first time, and that one seemed to be more superior than Ghosts and Goblins. The actual arcade port of Ghosts and Goblins is not that difficult to tell that it's more superior than the NES port. But the NES one is still good. Despite its flaws, some poor choices of weapons such as that flame. Yeah, the flame's quite useless. Insane difficulty, cryptic challenges, such as going through the game 3 times to get the proper ending, which has typos. But on the fair side, the game has unlimited continues, even at the checkpoint in the middle of the level, and it lets you keep your weapon that you had previously before. The only downside about continuing is that it resets your score, which is not a huge deal, by the way. The original arcade versions has its cryptic ways as well, and it can be as difficult as the NES port too. I never went through the arcade port, so I wouldn't really know for sure. And come to think of it, since the NES game was an arcade game, I think Capcom purposely made the arcade game difficult just to get more quarters out of your pocket. I also learned a lot about the NES version from other game reviewers, such as the Irate Gamer, and last year from the Angry Video Game Nerd. And I'm pretty convinced about a few things of what they said and what they think, but I wouldn't say this game's bad. And it's not great either. Especially these days, it's more difficult for me as of today's standards, and the replay value on the NES port pretty much wear out on me over the years. But I still have nostalgia memories about the NES version, but if I want to give it another go, I'll tell you one thing, I won't be fair with this one, because they weren't quite fair themselves. Okay, that was Ghosts and Goblins, my first horror game. Now let's talk about the memories of my second horror game, Castlevania. How I got started into Castlevania is when I rented the game, and when I played it, I was like, wow! I never seen anything like it before. Castlevania is no shadow of a doubt one of its kind. It had pretty much all the elements that a classic horror fan would ever want. It was a shocker for me when I was a kid, and I loved every moment of it. The characters and villains in Castlevania are more reasonable than what Ghosts and Goblins had to offer. As some of you can tell, Castlevania has been influenced by many horror films and novels such as Bram Stoker's Dracula. The Angry Video Game Nerd dig much more deeper into this game than I did. He came up with pretty good points that back then I wasn't aware of. That it had a bunch of horror cliches from both the classic Universal monster horror movies and the British Hammer horror films. I didn't think about all that at the time. Always been familiar with the Universal films, but it was many years later after playing Castlevania that I learned about the Hammer horror films. Now that I learned about the elements of what inspired Castlevania, I started getting more into the series these days than I did back then. And when you beat Castlevania, you will see a fake cast that uses names that Castlevania had been inspired from. Except they changed the names to avoid copyright issues, I believe. But I understand that they had to get the message out of what got the Castlevania game together. The game is fantastic for what it is. The follow-ups and spin-offs are excellent. The music is wonderful. Plus it has a great storyline involving a dark scenery with classic horror movie elements with the likes of Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, Grim Reaper, Greek mythology, Creature of the Black Lagoon, and much more to add to that category. So if you're a classic horror fan and a gamer, how could you go wrong? Well, for the most part, you can't go wrong. The reason why I said for the most part is because, just like Ghosts and Goblins, Castlevania can be a very hard game too. This game requires practice and patience as well. But with Castlevania, it can be worth it. But you will come across a few things that can be really irritating and put you in a very bad mood. Such as those Medusa heads with a wavy pattern, those hunchbacks that can be difficult to hit. And the worst part about Castlevania, in fact, the worst part about the NES Castlevania trilogy is the backwards fall. When you get hit, you fall back. Especially if you're near a pit. No matter what side you've been hit from, you always will fall back into the nearest pit. And that really sucks. I also forgot to mention, Ghosts and Goblins has that backwards fall issue too. Except it's even more deadlier in Castlevania. Well, at least in Castlevania you have a life bar, and you don't have to worry about getting hit twice to get killed like in Ghosts and Goblins. But if you're near a pit and you get hit, it's quite the opposite. Just like in Ghosts and Goblins, you have unlimited continues, which is awesome. But the downside about Castlevania compared to Ghosts and Goblins unlimited continues, After you lose all your lives, and you continue, you have to start at the beginning of the stage again. And when you lose a life, you lose your special weapon, and you have to upgrade your whip again. Yeah, how fair is that? I would say pretty unfair. The weapons in Castlevania are more reliable than the weapons in Ghosts and Goblins. The main weapon is the whip, which is known as the Vampire Killer, and it can be upgraded twice. And there are a lot of special weapons in the game, but you can only hold one at a time, of course. Now here's the weird part about Castlevania. As you notice in any other game, when you see a heart and touch it, it refills your health. But the hearts in Castlevania is your ammunition for your special weapon. Yeah, that's kind of bizarre, huh? To refill your health in Castlevania, you have to find a pork chop. Well, it will refill half of your health bar, depending on how low your health is. As far as my memories with Castlevania is concerned, I had a lot of fond memories of the game and the NES sequels, but unlike Ghosts and Goblins, I never did beat a Castlevania game when I was a kid. In fact, I never owned a Castlevania game as a kid either. Just like the Ghosts and Goblins game, during the 16-bit era, I lost interest in the series for a while, but nowadays I fell more in love with the Castlevania games more than ever. My top 5 Castlevania games are the NES trilogy, Super Castlevania 4 on the Super NES, and the Castlevania Bloodlines game on the Genesis. There are other good ones out there too, such as Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation, but the 5 I mentioned will always be my top choices in the Castlevania franchise. Alright, now I pretty much explained about my memories about both of the NES horror games I started out with when I was a kid. But between the two NES games, if I had the choice to choose between the two, well, I have a lot of respect for both games. I had wonderful memories about both of them, and they both have its ups and downs over each other. But in between the two, I would have to say the winner is Castlevania. Because Castlevania and its sequels is pretty much close to my cup of tea when it comes to my likings of both horror games and horror movies. I know this video was part of me explaining about my memories, but I also treated this video that it was kind of a few other things as well too, such as a review, a versus between the two games, and a reply to one of the internet reviewers that I've been inspired by, the Angry Video Game Nerd. So it's kind of a blend between different review subjects, because the Ultimate Gamer's House of Horror can be anything related to the horror category. And my regular UMG episodes and other spin-offs can be anything that suits the category too. Now it's time for the extras. There were other horror-type games on the NES, such as 2 great Castlevania sequels, Simon's Quest and Dracula's Curse, and 2 movie-based games from the 2 of the most popular horror franchises of the 80s, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. AVGN did a review on all 4 games that I mentioned. Now both Jason and Freddy games that I mentioned were a hit and miss to some fans, but AVGN stated Freddy and Jason games as horrible games. But most things he said about them, I would agree with, but I think he came down too hard on both of them. Because to me, both Freddy and Jason games are interesting. Don't get me wrong, they're not great games, but they're both good in a certain way. Yeah, I know they both are done by LJN. And I fully agree about what AVGN says about LJN games. LJN is known best for their notorious work on movie-based games. But the Freddy and Jason ones do stand out to me. And both of the Freddy and Jason games I had short memories of when I was a kid, because during that time when I got into them, I was already moving into the next generation of gaming at the time, and so I pretty much put the NES on the back burner for many years. There's other NES horror games that I learned years later, like learned from AVGN, such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now I fully agree with him on that one. That game is one of the most horrible NES games ever. AVGN also did 2 Halloween specials in 2008 of Dracula and Frankenstein, and the NES games involved in those videos were pretty awful too, but not as bad as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, of course. Okay, There's other horror type of games on NES, but I'm pretty much getting a little bit ahead of myself here. I will try to get around to reviewing those ones on the NES eventually, but now it's time to wrap everything up. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Please do like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, so long everyone.
Ultramaniac Gamer out.